I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order, and we'll get started with a roll call first. McKee here, Schultz here, Bottom,
Present.
Barenkamp,
Here.
Nichols.
Here.
Perfect. And we will get started. We got a busy work session with 2 items. We'll start with the buffer yard transition ordinance work session.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. This is an ordinance that we've looked at a couple times, starting the discussion back in May, and then last time in October, we had a more detailed discussion where we got more specific direction from you. Based this ordinance on some existing ordinances in Medina, Ramsey, and Rochester, and we talked about the things we liked in different ones and kind of melded that to create one that reflects the council direction for Corcoran. In the staff report, I did have a few questions that I highlighted where, as we started looking at this against some actual projects, some things we hadn't thought about came up that we wanted to talk a little bit about. If you go to the next slide, Jess. And Natalie talked about this last week when she was reviewing this concept plan. What I wanted to highlight with the exhibit that I included in the packet is just the scale of the potential buffer is generally not resulting in dramatic changes to the site plan, which on the one hand is good, right? There are some things that need to shift. For example, there are a number of ponds that are proposed in the buffer which our code would not allow. But I think there's room to move those around and accommodate that. A couple of questions, though, that came up that I thought we should be clear about is, as drafted, we do have a buffer against the urban reserve district. And we sort of, as staff, talked a little bit about that because we wanted, as council, we wanted to use the zoning in the matrix about how we establish the different buffers against different zoning districts. So we use urban reserve and we kind of treat it, we do treat it as a residential district for the purpose of this buffer ordinance. But we should acknowledge as a council that some of this urban reserve is going to ultimately develop as commercial. However, until that time, it's functioning as residential. So we felt like that was reasonable, but wanted to make sure the council was on board with that concept. Does that make sense, what I was saying? I see some nodding, so okay. So that was one of the questions, and that happens in this concept plan on the west side. You can see that this property butts up against urban reserve property. In this case, the urban reserve property will eventually be residential, but the concept remains the same.
Are you asking whether, you're asking a question, I want to clarify the question.
Mm-hmm.
Are you asking whether we are sure or for buffering against a UR zone? Or are you saying that should get an exception?
Sort of both. I think I'm questioning in the UR zone, should the underlying land use be a factor in the level of buffering? So for example, would you have a different level of a buffer that is against a UR zone that's planned for residential versus a buffer against a UR zone that's planned for commercial?
It's one of those things where if it's commercial, we obviously don't want to do a ton of large plantings because they're going to get torn up and the commercial is going to continue. That's what you're...
No, I'm just saying that, for example, on that west property line
Yep.
on this concept, we want to protect that existing residential that's in
Yeah.
the urban reserve from this new development. I'm oversimplifying this a little bit. But this is going to be here in perpetuity. So the level of buffer, should we treat it like it's a residential property that we're protecting or that it's a future commercial property? I'm assuming it's a residential property. That's how I wrote it. But if there was anyone who felt like that was too restrictive, this would be the time to kind of look at land use.
So in the draft, we're treating UR and RR identically.
Correct.
So the question is, do we want to change that? I think it makes sense to leave it as is, because the basis for making this modification to code is to deal with things like what we saw with Corcoran Farms, and we're hearing now with Pioneer Trail project. The people who live there usually don't care what the future use is, they care about their current use, and this change is really intended to benefit surrounding property owners today versus the future. So it seems like a reasonable approach to continue with.
And that's how we drafted it. I just wanted to raise the issue. The next question that I had, and again, came up with this, something we hadn't thought about, is we have a cemetery that exists today in the purple on this example, and a church and a cemetery that exists today. And should there be any exemption from the buffering for things like cemeteries, which is basically a big lawn? Do you really need to buffer the big lawn, whether it exists today or is proposed, from adjacent properties?
It's not really a big lawn, just for the record. It's something more to a cemetery than just a big.
is true.
Visually.
Yes.
Visually, there's no structure. We've written it so that there is no exemption for that. But I did want to raise it because we'll deal with it shortly, probably deal with it shortly. So I just didn't want to write an ordinance that then you gave a variance to right away.
What do you do if the cemetery had a mausoleum in it? And how big they build his mausoleum?
Fair? Yeah, I mean, it could have a structure, is your point, I think, right?
Yeah.
Guess it depends.
It is a quiet neighbor. I get the point that Scott is making.
It's true.
You could say, well, so.
I would not make an
I'm
exception for
sorry.
Okay.
cemetery.
I didn't make an exception in the draft, but I wanted to raise it because you're probably going to deal with it shortly.
Gotcha.
In that purple though is the water tower site also though. Is there
Correct.
anything we need to be concerned about there since its location and everything else, or?
So what the ordinance would say as drafted, and I think that's going to be my next point about existing uses that expand, as drafted, this is a subdivision, and that's going to trigger this buffer ordinance. And so there is no exemption for
Okay.
existing uses, and that buffer will need to run along that whole west property line. Even though, you know, there's no buffer there today, and what you'll be doing is adding buffering between the existing use and the existing use. It's probably cleaner, though, because it's a subdivision
Okay.
to do that. So that's how we've drafted that. But I just, again, I want to call these things out that are going to probably come up if this project moves ahead. The other question is, can you, who's controlling the PowerPoint? Can you point to the park up on Hunter Road there that's proposed? So right there, that's, at least as proposed, is a private open space. There's no housing there. There is no exemption in this draft for an unbuildable outlot or a open space. And again, I think Natalie brought this up when she raised it last council meeting, but I wanted to raise it again. That would still require that same buffer along that lot line between this park or whatever it is and that existing neighborhood. So you could exempt unbuildable parcels, but we did not do that. We said that buffer is required.
With these buffers, are we talking about monuments like wetland buffers and developments, outlining those, and, or are we just talking, here's a strip of land, you're out of it?
We do not have a buffer sign, but we do have a strip of land, and we would have a conservation easement over that strip of land. So it would show up on people's parcel surveys. And then what we would likely do is have the conservation easement in favor of the city, like we do for tree conservation easements in Tavera. So the homeowner would buy it knowing that they could not cut those trees or remove the berm or, remove the fence. There's a lot of options for how to manage that buffer, and they would be restricted in that. It would be on their property, under an easement. They could not remove those items.
But in the case of the outlot, how would that impact? If it's not someone's lot, I mean, they wouldn't be
So
voting anyway.
if this proceeded, as this concept shows, that outlot would be maintained by a homeowners association. And so that homeowners association would have that same easement and restriction.
Gotcha.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please do.
If, let's pretend in this, that the urban reserve I know this is a question later, specifically to residential on residential. If that gets developed into commercial property, would there then be required a double buffer because it's required now and then another one?
Correct, yes.
Okay, that's what I thought.
It leads to a second question, though, on that same outlot, if that were, and it's not, but if it were that urban reserve were commercial next to this outlot, would we require that commercial user to provide a buffer against an unoccupied, unbuildable outlot? At this point, we don't distinguish, and they would.
Who would?
The
ordinance.
commercial developer on that urban reserve would have to provide the double buffer against this park. So they would provide a buffer on their property. Yes, thank you.
Watch out, all the eyes in the back.
It's up high, we're safe.
Okay.
Laser safety is important.
So, your question implies the only good use for a piece of land would be occupying it or putting a house on it.
That's not what I meant to.
No, I know, but, so, I know you didn't mean it that way, but depending on what does what with that property, if they choose to have it, if it's a wetland, which dries sometimes, or if it's unbuildable in some manner, but usable to walk on or usable to do whatever. Not here, like if you would four-wheeler on it or whatever, then I think we get into gray really bad if we say if it's unbuildable or whatever. To not require it, I think it would be gray, it would be way too gray, and it gets into the eye of the beholder. The owner and user of that property may not wish to or may wish to have a buffer because they don't want to be disturbed or whatever, doing other things that aren't building or whatever.
And I would add to that, John, the buffer yards don't have to be that extensive in the table. So even at the highest level of buffer required, you can do it in 30 feet if you put in a fence as well. So I don't think it has to be a huge taking if it were to be required. And that would only apply if you've got a very intensive use going up against a residential sort of use. So it incentivizes the city to be careful how we handle transitions so we don't have, major differences that would require bigger buffers. But I think in most areas that I've seen on the planning map, it should be palatable based on the parcel sizes. Do we know of any parcels that are so small and are adjacent to significantly different uses that it would be a significant loss to have to put in the buffer that would be envisioned?
You
What was
can,
it? Sorry, go ahead.
your meeting.
That's fine. Go for it.
Yeah.
Then you run into people subdivide 5 acres sometimes and put 5 houses on it. So that,
But those wouldn't require a buffer per se. If they're all the same use, you end up just with the regular rear setback requirement at the periphery of that.
if it's a resident, RSF1 backing up to an RSF1, 5 new homes, that wouldn't be required to buffer against the same. But that's a question later, isn't it? Whether if it's a new housing development, even if it's the same, do you require a buffer in that situation too, right?
Right, so what we've proposed, based on the direction last week, in that case, is you don't require a buffer, but you do require the perimeter setback to be the rear yard setback, abutting adjacent developments, in that case.
And that's intended to deal with scenarios like the Tabors faced, where they had like a 10-yard or 10-foot setback.
Yeah, yeah. Or you?
Mine is fine because they're rear to rear.
Oh, okay.
It didn't have to be that way.
Is your
It would
question-
prevent something like that
Yeah.
happening.
Is your question more just a lot that would be so small that they couldn't physically do a buffer?
Yeah.
There are 2, I think, that could be challenging, and one is the commercial outlot in Bellwether. as you enter Bellwether off of 101. There's a small commercial outlot, separated by a street from the residential homes. But it's a smallish lot that could be somewhat
That would
challenging.
require a B? So that would be a commercial going into RSF 3? Is that how we would treat that?
Yes.
And with a B, they could get by with a 10-foot buffer with a 4-foot fence and plantings,
Yeah.
which
I
doesn't seem ridiculous either to fit.
No, I don't know if we'd want a fence since it's at that corner, but yes, they could. I think they could do it. I'm just saying that's one of the smaller ones. And then the other one that's terrible is the parcels that used to be the store across from the meat market. You know, there's those 3 tiny, tiny lots.
Yeah.
Hat notes.
The Pat Note store.
But those are practically unbuildable today, so
Yeah.
they don't. you
We
know.
shouldn't worry too much about.
Right.
I think that would, I know it's not a word people like, but that would be the kind of the definition of a variance would be appropriate in some,
Yeah, that's
some law like that where they
Unbuildable
can't do it
without
otherwise, yeah.
Yeah. But otherwise, I don't think there's any other really challenging areas. We really do in our comp plan and zoning try to transition from low to medium to higher intensities as a general rule, with some of these community or neighborhood commercials being the exception. But even there, I think we're okay.
Thank you.
And then my last question really from the staff report was about local streets. We did write it so that, again, like Medina and Ramsey, arterial streets or major roadways, I should say, serve as the buffer. So there's no buffer for this project needed along 116 or 30, no buffer requirement, and that's consistent with the other ones we looked at. The only question we wanted to raise again was, in this case, if you look in the southwest corner, there's a local street that separates this project from the neighboring property. And should any consideration be given to that local street serving as a buffer? Serving in lieu of a buffer or modifying the buffer? The code as the draft does not give any flexibility for that, but just wanted to raise it.
I was thinking how we could handle that. I would be okay not providing credit, but if we did want to provide credit, maybe you would treat a local street as a Class A, or maybe even a Class B. So instead of having a 30-foot buffer with 2 overstory plantings or understory plantings, you would have a 60-foot right-of-way.
That comes up tonight, that same situation, doesn't it?
Does the street divide? I don't think it does, because the industrial use would require a level B. It would require a level D.
Where's the leveling defined in here?
It is on a chart.
Page 10
Towards the back.
of the PDF or page 4 of the code pages.
Yeah. this one.
Table
Yep, that
2.
one.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And then on the next page has like what those,
Yeah, what they mean.
yeah.
So there's 4 levels of the buffer yard, and there's several options within each level to accomplish this, the buffering or transition requirements with just landscaping or incorporating fences or buffers or those kinds of, or excuse me, fences or berms in that buffer.
So Jeremy, were you proposing that maybe we count them all? Any situation like that, it would be the B or A?
As an example, if you've got, say Pioneer Industrial wasn't industrial.
Okay.
Let's say it's an RSF 3 going up against a rural residential zone. So that would, in the chart, RSF 3 against rural residential requires a B. So if there were a local street, if we agreed on this approach, we would say the local street counts as the buffer. Are we okay with that level of mismatch? If not, we could say A. And if even that isn't an appropriate transition, so that would be like, if it was an RSF 2 coming in to a rural residential, you would have a local street separating rural residential from something like Ravinia or Tavera. Is that adequate? If it's not, then we should just say, we're not going to count local streets as anything. But that's sort of the degree of mismatch that we would want to be comfortable with accepting.
Gotcha. So would that, and if this is a dumb question, sorry, let's say there's something that would be a C, so RSF2 to, let's see here, actually.
Or in this case, it's a D. This requires, in this example, it requires a D buffer adjacent to that local street. And so if I understood, the suggestion would be, it still requires a D. You would only waive the buffering requirements if the requirement was, in your example, a B or an A.
Okay, that's what I was trying to
Am I
figure out.
understanding?
So you wouldn't get partial credit,
That's.
but if you needed a D, you would have to do a D. If you only needed a B, the street would stand in for the buffer. I don't care which way. I just wanted to propose that as an option
Yeah.
if people are concerned about not giving credit for a street.
I think I'd be okay with the way that you just summarized it, Kendra. And it sounds like that's what you were saying. My thought initially was, do we count that as like a percentage of anything, and it maybe bumps it down to a lower level, but maybe that
That
just,
gets too complicated.
it probably does.
To me, this example here, where you have the buffer against the street between two filtration ponds, doesn't make sense to me to even have a buffer in that zone. Only to move the ponds out of there. The ponds are the buffer between that and the buildings.
Yeah, that was another question I have. I know we talked about uses in there, and I don't remember if we had extensive discussion or what the reasoning on not allowing ponds in the buffer. Does anyone happen to remember that?
I wasn't here
That-
for the.
I think the
October one.
concern that we had was if you allowed it, then they would just put the ponds at the edges and avoid having to put in landscaping or berms or whatever, and just treat the ponds as an acceptable divider between an industrial and a residential area. So think to Corcoran Farms, if they had, a pond along the neighboring party's border. Is that the kind of policy outcome we want?
So, in that instance, we'd probably want a little more screening, but
Yep.
the spacing, the extra space would help.
I mean, maybe you want to allow 10 feet of pond incursion into the buffer, if you want to allow some of it, but still require them to have the right planting level around it.
This is a dumb question, but again, the heels of a dumb, supposed dumb question. Does the watershed, so these filtration ponds would be official watershed wetlands, or is that not true? Are filtration ponds determined to be wetlands per the watershed with their own buffers?
No, the filtration ponds are stormwater ponds under the
Yeah.
watershed rules. So stormwater ponds and the filtration basins or bioswales don't require buffers.
So they don't count really as a wetland per se?
No.
But wetlands, just to complicate things a little bit further, wetlands are different than a filtration pond.
The wetland doesn't have a buffer. Yeah, you're right.
So an existing wetland, somebody couldn't come in and put a wetland unless they really, you could do a wetland
real wetland.
restoration,
Yeah.
and that would be sort of spendy, but it would work. I guess the question is, would a wetland be a decent buffer if it was a real wetland determined by the watershed? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm inclined to do the same thing where it's like 10 feet of a pond or a wetland. I think most people,
idea.
We have a wetland setback already with something like that.
I don't know if it goes
You wouldn't for a
through the
filtration
border.
pond, right?
No, there's no there are buffers and then setbacks from the buffer for wetland, but not for stormwater ponds or rain gardens. There's no setback.
I like the idea of allowing, whether it's 10 or some amount of it to go into there to give some flexibility, and that keeps them from intentionally placing it there to replace the entire buffer. But if it's going in there, at the worst case is that there's gonna be more space at least. So it's not necessarily a bad outcome.
So you would keep the same planting requirement for whatever the space they're leaving, but the pond could be up to 10 feet within? Are we all okay with that idea? Any concerns from staff with that approach?
I don't think so. I'm thinking about, I don't think the planting plans are extraordinary, so I think you could still have wetlands in that buffer and make the plantings work. Or not wetlands, I'm sorry. Stormwater ponds, sorry.
We know what you mean.
Stormwater ponds.
Can I ask a general counsel question?
Go for it.
Just because it's come up before, with respect to extra buffering, would you ever consider, if you add to the buffer, subtracting some of the tree requirements within the plan, or is that not
The
allowed?
overall landscaping.
I don't think so. That's not the intent. You're not trying to shift required landscaping out to the edges. This is over and above, I think.
But
But that is a good question.
if you,
What are you asking?
well, the question is, if, let's suppose somebody's, what we're concerned about with the buffer is the impact to the neighbor. So if somebody came in and they said, we could make the buffers double what you want if you would give a little bit on some of the trees go on the inside of the development.
What we're talking like
Couldn't-
tonight.
Kind of like what we're talking, not specifically to that, but it's come up multiple times
Yeah.
to incentivize people when you move into a development, you're not, I think you're not as concerned about the tree coverage as the people outside the development want the tree coverage at the
Want the
edges.
screening, yeah.
And I think most people, when they move in, so take industrial off the table, but when they move into a development, a lot of people or plant trees. So that probably would fill in a lot of the trees that the developer would be required to put in anyways, in my opinion.
I gotcha.
The first thing I did was, back when I lived in a development, was put in more vegetation.
Right. Well, I mean, someone could still come in with a PUD and ask for flexibility on the landscape requirements like we've seen before. And maybe this points them in the direction of saying something like, okay, we'll double the buffers, but this is the flexibility we're asking for on the overall landscaping. It
Okay.
wouldn't prevent that,
A half credit.
or something.
If you put
Yeah.
one tree in the buffer, you get a half credit outside the buffer, so then it wouldn't be a 1-for-1, but I don't know, that's just a thought.
I think we're probably going to encounter it. I think it's fair to hear them out. I don't think we have to rule it out in the code, but more trees is better, in my view. I'm sure that's a surprise to everyone.
I don't know if anybody would say less trees are better, except actually my prairie,
In your prayer restoration?
the US Fish and Wildlife guy is very adamant that trees are bad.
Yeah,
He's the only person I've ever heard say that.
birds can't fly through them.
That's true.
So those were my specific questions for you, but you've had a chance to look at the code, and I'm just wondering if we had a couple things we discussed. Are there some things you want to see changed? Are you comfortable with it as drafted? I don't mean to push, but I know you got another agenda item, so I'm trying to,
I had one quick one. I think I addressed it with Natalie prior, but in buffer yard class B, in that table, the 20-foot and 10-foot rows, both have a min 4-foot fence, but I think the plantings are supposed to be more intense on the narrower. So I think the 4 and the 2 and the 6 and the 3 need to be like.
I'm sorry, I did get your message, and that is correct. I flipped that. That is correct. There's a change to that in the table.
Oh, catch.
That's all I have.
Yeah, I think generally we seem comfortable with the few points of clarification that Kendra had us go over, other than maybe wanting to add in some of the language about allowing some of the ponds
Do we want to do that, allow ponds to encroach 10 feet into the buffer?
I think that's.
Mitigation ponds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
So it allows some flexibility, but not dump everything in that area to get rid of having to do a buffer.
Okay, well then we
There's no
can,
natural vegetation.
Hmm.
If there's already no natural vegetation in the buffer.
So what,
I mean, you're just saying that they could cut down trees and put their vegetation pond in, or filtration pond 10 feet in that way?
they could,
I mean, we give them credit, right? If there's a natural row of trees, they get credit for that in this.
yeah.
But in an instance, let's say for the example of that one where they've got a city street and a buffer, let's say where that city street is right now is a whole row of hardwood trees that are 80 years old or whatever. Are we saying because they're gonna put a street in, they can, well, they probably end up losing the trees anyway with the street, I guess, but.
Potentially, but I don't know that changing this would affect that. That wouldn't necessarily be prohibited in and of itself now.
but you
Yeah.
do raise an excellent point that I can't believe is missing on the bottom of page 5. Natural buffers, any of the following can qualify as an acceptable measure for transitioning existing topo like hills and swales, wetlands, lakes and streams, major roadways. But we did not put existing forested areas. And we
Let's do that.
we probably should add that.
Yeah, I wouldn't like people cutting down trees just to put plantings in to satisfy a buffer.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, that's probably the most important one.
This is why we talk about things.
Yeah.
I don't want to go too deep, but is there a way to, around the mitigation ponds, if they do go into that buffer, to plant trees and other vegetation that'll actually help with that water mitigation? And I only go to, Heidi in the Napa store taking down all those spruce. And I don't know how many times she called me and said, the spruce did more mitigation than putting in a pond, but we still, all of those spruce trees are gone. Is there any, I assume there's a lot of truth to it because of her knowledge and stuff, but I don't want to get too complicated on this, but
The ponding's required by the state, by the watershed.
no, I know all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
but is there a way that the vegetation around those mitigation ponds did help with that mitigation, actually, the filtering of that water and such?
Or is there a specific type of something we'd want to recommend?
Yeah.
For there?
yeah,
Just
I mean,
asking.
then that site was so small that there was no way to provide the ponding required by the state.
Right.
And preserve those trees in that case. But I think generally if we add, which should have been in there, that you get credit for preserving those trees, I think people will work to preserve those trees and shift the pond. I think is maybe what you're asking.
Yeah, but I'm concerned sometimes you put a pond next to some of these hardwood trees, they don't take the water that well. If you know what I mean. Certain
Right.
species do, but you add a pond and you disturb roots around a maple or even an oak. They don't like it. Where spruce and other trees, it's like, hey, give me more water.
So we do look at the grading plans with our landscape architects for exactly that. If somebody says you're gonna preserve a tree, we wanna look at the grading plan and see if we believe you
Okay.
based on that. So we try to check that, and then if it's not, if we don't believe it's gonna be preserved, we don't give them credit for preserving it. So I
Got it.
think that's how we address that. I think, if I understand what you're asking.
Yeah, you do. I did, the past, there's some oak trees that are standing 7.5 feet away from a major highway or a major city road, and the developer said those trees would never last, and my gosh, they're flourishing just as
Yeah.
much as the day they put the road in and stuff, so, thanks.
I-
Nope,
yeah,
you don't
I
need to change anything.
We've got 3 changes, correcting the error in the table, allowing the ponds to encroach, and giving the council the ability to give credit for existing forested areas. And with that, I think we'll make the revisions, and we'll schedule this either for March or April. We're gonna just look at schedules for public hearing then, and then it'll be back to either March or April.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Can I ask a question? I wasn't here for the October meeting where you talked about ownership. So how does, I see in here you have a provision to transfer ownership from the original developer to a landowner homeowners association or some conservation group subject to city approval. What's the level of oversight then of this area if it's transferred to somebody other than an association?
So, at the October meeting, I think generally, in single family, it's a bad idea to have the association own these transition buffer yards. And Medina and Ramsey agreed, because they've been using this for a while. What happens is, this buffer benefits a couple landowners, and the HOA as a whole doesn't benefit from it, so they don't deal with it. They let it go tax forfeit. It's an issue. So where we will be encouraging people is to just create an easement in the backyard, so in your backyard, you have that. But we wanted to leave the option, because if it's a townhome association where there's an active association that's already gonna own open space, an association makes the most sense to maintain in those cases. We left the conservation group in there. I just had a meeting with the land trust, and they said, no way, Jose, we don't want that kind of stuff. But we left it in there in case something changes. So those were kind of the 3 options. So I would suggest to you that for a single-family home neighborhood, it's gonna be an easement in the backyard that the homeowner is responsible for, and the easement, like the tree conservation easement to Vera, their HOA is responsible, but it benefits the city, so we can enforce it. If it's a apartment, a commercial, townhomes, it'll probably be an association maintained outlot.
So, I mean, you probably didn't have any discussion on that, but how does enforcement work or monitoring of it, right? I'm sitting there and all of a sudden I say, oh, that tree fell down. I cut it up and go, well, somebody comes out 3 weeks later and just sees the stump, well, it broke off and fell down.
Well, what the city of Ramsey will say, that was their biggest challenge. And their direction was, do not require as much landscaping as we do, because it will not survive. It's too much in that area. And so we looked more at Medina's model, because the forester said that is his biggest beef with their ordinance in Ramsey, is the trees die. They're choking each other out, and it looks terrible, and then people feel like they can't cut it down. So one of the ways we dealt with it is, first of all, making sure that they're spread out enough that we think they can thrive. But there is gonna be some maintenance. Trees do die, for one reason or another.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is, if someone were to clear cut something, that's when they go in and say, you need to replant this. If something dies or gets, knocked over, they have not been in Ramsey making homeowners 10 years later go replant the tree.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I assume we'll enforce this. I think just from the devil's in the details when we write our first conservation easement over this area. We'll have to work through that. And I would suggest we look at Ramsey and Medina as models. But they're generally, they tell me, staff tells me, they're not if something comes down because of a windstorm, they're not making people replace them.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the person that takes it down and it,
Yeah, you don't want that to
Malicious,
happen. It
right.
has happened in Ramsey, and they were able to get them to replant it, and they had to threaten that they would go replant it, which is not a position you want to be in. They got it replanted, and
So,
it's challenging, because people buy this, they think it's their land, but it's their land, but it's restricted.
yeah.
I hesitate in adopting new policies without being clear on some of the enforcement thereof. So, are we gonna have that discussion before we approve of these new policies? Because nothing's worse than, we've run into it time and again in our town where we enact some new piece of code, and then we're kind of like stuck when people don't abide by it. And then, I mean, we've got that semi-trailer parked in that person's yard, and it's been there for like 5 years, and we've been trying to get it moved, and it can't. So,
I think we can certainly have that discussion, because we'll have a bit of time before it even gets to the planning commission hearing, and then another couple weeks till it goes to council after that, so we put it on an agenda.
yeah, I want to
Or-
approach what happens if no one does any of this stuff, like, or the
Gotcha.
trees die, or whatever.
Yeah, maybe we could
'Cause, you know,
put that in an agenda.
I could work
discuss
with the
that aspect.
attorney, and we could, everyone's gonna be a little different, but we could try to use Ramsey or Medina's template as a model and draft something up and bring that back before we go to public hearing. Is that what I'm
That'd be great.
hearing? I think sounds great.
Is the buffering, the tree planting, buffering for commercial more or less than what we currently have in our ordinance if you were developing in a commercial area?
Well, it's more, because in general, we have a tree or landscape ordinance right now, and you still have to meet that with number of trees. Plus, you have to now add on this extra layer of transition zone, so you'll end up with more landscaping.
Okay.
What I would say is our current ordinance and how we work with people is we try to get them on commercial developments to focus their landscaping on the perimeter of the site. And I think we don't have a lot of history on commercial developments, but I think the last 2 industrial parks, we've been pretty successful on doing that. So in that sense, it won't look that different, but it will now require that on day one. It won't be us telling them to move the trees there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Anything else on that one? Okay, let's move on to a second item, which is PUD ordinance updates.
You can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just put together some slides to kind of just reiterate what was said in the staff report. So I won't go through it step by step. It's more just to help guide your discussion. I think the big ones, actually go to the next slide. I think there's some things that came up with the discussion of open space and how we define it, how we're calculating it. And Kendra and I also had an in-depth discussion about it yesterday, trying to apply it to an existing development. Essentially, some things that have come up since the packet went out is that staff is thinking that we should consider having areas that are under a typical D&U easement because of just the lot lines, not because of its being a floodplain or wetland or a stormwater pond, should also count towards the open space requirement. So just that standard D&U easement that encompasses the 10 feet around the perimeter of each site. If it's not because of an additional water feature, just having that be open space if it is open space. And then also, we think we need to clarify that the 15% should potentially be based on the estimated net post-development land calculations versus the gross acreage. So this would be the total land, less floodplain, wetlands, and land under the 100-year ordinary high water level. Next slide. So this just kind of provides an example of if we were to calculate the 15% based on the gross acreage, if we're looking at Ravinia, they would have been required to dedicate roughly an additional 40 acres of land that did not have any wetland in it to be kept as open space, and that would have likely impacted roughly 80 homes. We kind of put a red box on an area where we think that would have likely been expanded upon the park system and would just been kept as open space. Obviously, that's conjecture, and the number would vary based on where in the site they actually would have done this. But generally, the concern is this could unintentionally result in smaller lots throughout the rest of the development. Some of these 75-foot lots would have likely needed to be reduced down to 65 or less. So if we're okay with allowing smaller lots to proceed, then the open space at 15% is fine. I just wanted to call this out as something to keep in mind. And that's also why staff is recommending a post-development calculation rather than the pre-development. Next slide. And yeah, just additional questions. One specifically is the discussion of the neighborhood meeting. When should these occur, before the sketch plat or before preliminary plat? The staff report talks about the pros and cons of each. And that's really all I have for you. I'm here for questions.
Okay, thank you. Could you go back, is it 1 or 2 slides? Well, let's one farther. Yes, I guess let's just tackle it on some of the additions since the DNU easement. Where do we sit on? I think that makes sense. I don't know that I have an issue with that addition.
My initial reaction was it departs from the previous version of this ordinance improvement, where we were trying to get larger areas of open space that were consolidated. The 15% I thought was intended to give us a smaller number, but a more consistent application. So if you allow the inclusion of, the 10 feet around each lot as open space, it doesn't really.
To be clear, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying like if we have open space, but on the perimeter, we just have our typical DNU easement, it would still
Not to
have to be
deduct
land as
that.
part of a bigger open land. I'm not talking about private yards. I'm talking about like a larger open space within the PUD.
Oh, so like if there's a gas main or something comes into the development?
Yeah, like as long as it's actually truly open and it's a common space that's usable.
Oh, okay.
So if it's
Not
part of that,
taking out
not
big-
deducting it.
Then that makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I meant, so I apologize, it didn't come through.
Okay.
So if it's that,
Then I'm fine with that. That makes sense to me.
any other thoughts on that?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Since Mark from Planning Commission is here,
Mhm.
is there any chance we can have him chime
Sure.
in these different?
If he wants to.
My comments on this, I think, are attached. I submitted written comments. I think that they're attached as the last page to the notes. I don't really have anything additional to add to those comments.
Okay.
Do you have any specific questions or?
No, I don't.
Gotcha.
Were these the comments you emailed us?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think one item we should probably come to understanding on, the intent of the percentage point requirement wasn't to indicate that something would automatically be approved if they hit the threshold. The intent of the percentage point requirement was to give staff leverage as they're negotiating with the developer. You need to clear this threshold before council will see it and
Right.
will process it as an application. And then council still gets to negotiate and determine if there's anything extraordinary that would make us not want to approve it.
Right. That's the
As
base.
I envision how the points tally, I would very likely approve something that met it, but you wouldn't be required to. So it's not replacing the council's discretion in approving a PUD and acting in that legislative capacity. But what it does do is sort of put what we say is important to us based on what we put into the code right in front of any applicant, so they know how to be successful.
Right. And ideally, it prevents some of the really early on stuff that would maybe gets changed 10 times to get to a place where we'd want to consider it, and it's a baseline for that. But Jess, you and I, sorry, you and I did speak a little bit about this yesterday or the other day, about potentially adding some language that clarifies that it wouldn't mean, just because you meet this threshold doesn't mean you get approval, just means that.
Yeah.
Can I talk to Natalie about that a bit?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, the current draft of the ordinance has very, the language is not very strong, but it's kind of what I was trying to indicate. So I'd be happy to clarify that.
Gotcha.
By explaining that this is basically the threshold for further discussion with city council.
Gotcha.
So you're saying that for the council to consider a PUD on a parcel of land, they would at least have to have a minimum 15% conservation on it?
I think that's just for
No.
low-density residential. Is that right?
So the 15% open space is an underlying standard of the PUD that they don't get any points for. That's just what you need if you want a PUD. That's one of the strict standards that we had talked about applying. And then the points is for things above and beyond. So they would need to, let me pull it up. They would need to meet the 15% open space. They can't have any of the prohibited design modifications. And then they also need to meet 75% of the point system before this gets forwarded to council with a staff recommendation for approval.
And the PUD for 15% is for PUDs that include residences or dwellings. So if it was just a commercial or just an industrial.
Yes, thank you.
Those
Yes,
wouldn't
that is
require
true.
15%.
So
Good point.
what if it's a small parcel of land that can't accommodate?
There is a minimum, is there a minimum?
So if it's a smaller parcel of 30 acres, less than 30 acres, then they would still be subject to meeting the underlying standards, and they would have to meet a few categories. I put in here, projects less than 30 acres shall provide at least 3 public benefits contemplated within the point system. An applicant may petition for credit of a proposed PUD benefit that's not captured by our point system. But they would still have to have 2 other benefits that are contemplated within our system. So they would have they wouldn't have as many points that they have to meet when it's smaller land, but they would still, if it's a low-density residential project, they would still need open space.
Yeah.
And that was a limitation that Maple Grove said that they had run into, that it really was not, the point system does not work well on small
Smaller
parcels
lots,
less than
no.
30 acres. So that was something I incorporated, learning off their experience.
Gotcha. Did you have a specific concern with the 15 or with the open space?
Well, the 15%, I wish I would have been here for the discussion in October. But to me, the 15% is another way to look at the discussion we had before about conservation with zoning, giving credit for different sized units. We're just saying you can go smaller if you give up 15%, and that's the beginning of your PUD. So basically, we're requiring anything over 30 acres to have at least 15% land set aside.
I see what you're saying.
And one option is we could make it a points category if we don't want it a strict standard, but something that projects get points for when they do it. But at one point, the direction from council was to have it be a strict standard of all PUDs. But we can definitely create more flexibility if that's a concern.
Or they still get points if they go beyond that, so.
They do get points if they go beyond and above the 15% open space, and they would also get, and this is something Councilor Nichols pointed out, they would get points if the open space, even if it's the 15% required, if it has mature trees that they're preserving, because you can have open space that doesn't have a wooded area. So there are points that they can still get for not dedicating that open space, but for having that open space. but if we wanted to have more options in terms of what flexibility they really need to ask for, then we might want to look at just having it be a points category.
Gotcha.
Because if we do require it, they are going to be asking for smaller lots.
But they ask for smaller lots anyway. I mean, that's.
Well, this is true, but, I mean, to one extent, like, using Ravinia as example, they had 75-foot lots, they had
They built very
65-foot
few
lots.
of them.
So it likely would have resulted in much, like, 60-foot lots probably would have been more the average in that case. If that's okay, then we can, then that's fine.
What is the average?
I don't know what the average is, but if
55?
we pull up that image,
On theirs?
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, they came in several times
And
after the
changed it,
fact to
yeah.
lower the size of
Yeah.
lots.
yeah, no, and that's fair. Again, I'm just trying to point out a small limitation that if one of the underlying goals was to hopefully encourage larger lots, that may conflict with the open space requirement. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And I think we're gonna get smaller lots regardless.
Okay.
Even if we don't do anything. So I see a major benefit to the city in having the 15% open space preservation more consistently. Even if you do have to shrink lot sizes a bit, and I think another thing we had envisioned at one point was they could use the twin home model to get more units onto smaller spaces within the low density, because that's a permitted use for RSF3.
Theoretically,
There are
yes.
tools they can use to get to the density target, and we would be still in a position to say that's too small, potentially, if we feel like it's unreasonable when we see one, because again, we're not required to accept it just because they hit the point target. But we're gonna see small lots. We may as well get something significant in exchange for it.
In the, with the rights in Greater Corcoran, if you have 100 acres and you have 10 rights to build, you could, in theory, build 10 half-acre sites, and then you use up your 10 rights, and we have 95 open space acres, and only 5 acres, or, yeah, 5 acres have houses on them. And if we can, but that's what we'll end up with, is more open space, but smaller lots. Since they're asking for smaller lots anyways, we might as well get something out of the deal. And if,
I don't know if it's as much applicable to those scenarios as it is where there's like a big subdivision, is it?
Huh? This concept is the same. If you
Yeah.
squeeze
But
a
would they
lot of
be,
houses into a small area, you have more open space. It's part of why we have the right system.
But the thing that I remember is that Paulson property where it was 90 acres, they set aside half of it and they doubled
Yeah,
their rights.
there's a bonus.
There was that bonus of doubling,
Yeah.
so,
With our open space and preservation.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's in the rural area though, and this would be specific to urban.
This is specific to-
Yeah, I mean, we do have some areas where, open space and preservation plat would need a PUD, like if they have, community septic and community well. But those can be done without a PUD.
okay.
Aren't we trying to get rid of the double and triple? We don't have triple rights anymore.
Don't have triple, yeah, it's 150 or 200%.
Yeah. But just limit it to, we'll have more space if the lots are smaller.
So what's the open space gonna be used as? It's just gonna sit there as a benefit for the people in that development?
So
Who maintains it and,
Neighborhoods.
Yeah, the developer or the applicant shall be required to submit an open space plan along with the PUD development plan, which will illustrate the use and or function of the open space areas. So I think the idea is that it would be usable space in terms of like people can have access to it, they can maybe, I don't know, have a grad party or something on it, but they would be able, it would be open space. There's no, I mean, I don't,
We'd envisioned trails at one point. Is that,
yeah, I think trails would be compatible with the sense of open space.
It'd be a
Yeah, if it-
private amenity.
I mean, yeah, it would be private, because we're not saying that this space needs to be dedicated to the city. There's opportunity if they are proposing a public park and it's not considered in our comp plan and we accept it, there's opportunity to count that as part of the open space, so there's chance for recreational uses on it. I don't think that would be counter to it, but the idea that it's not homes, that it's something more beneficial to the community, and hopefully a larger community as well.
I think ideal state it would be open to the public generally.
Okay.
Do we want to make that a requirement?
How would you do that if it's not a public park?
Yeah, I would have to, I think, ask names on that.
Yep.
I mean, I think it'd be one thing, I think with Hope, that's something that they're just offering. They're offering it to be public. So maybe, again, that's points, additional points, if you make it open to the public, and it's more of a negotiation piece rather than
A
requiring it.
requirement? That would be fine.
Okay,
We could
we
negotiate.
can add that.
And I'm kind of wondering if we want to look into a little bit again on, is that 15 for that baseline requirement the right number? Is it, would we see less of a concerning drop in potential lot widths if it's 12% or whatever? And then if they could still go above that and get the points that way, but that way we're not necessarily saying it's only gonna be 65 feet or whatever it would turn out to be, foot lots.
There actually is some advantage, and I debated bringing this up at the goal-setting session. Keeping within the general code, so not PUDs, but considering the cost of road reconstruction over time, it may actually be better for the city to have narrower but deeper lots. So you have more people contributing funds to the road reconstruction versus wider, shallower lots. So if you put, 25 homes on one side of a street and the lots are 160 feet deep versus 10 lots and they're 80 feet deep, you'll have a lot more tax capacity per unit of asphalt, and you'll end up with lower taxes because of how you're spreading the cost of the road reconstruction around. So I'm not necessarily as concerned about lot width as I am overall lot size, the more I think about the long-term economics. So personally, I'm not super concerned about 60-foot lots versus 65.
Well, I think that changes your whole look of your city. If you've got all these condensed homes where you've got basically row homes stacked on top of each other with a little walkway in between. It also, I mean, they're gonna build out to the max, so the next thing they're gonna ask for is 5-foot setbacks instead of 10 and 5.
I put that in, they cannot request anything that would result in a building separation of less than 15 feet. No PUD would be granted.
Okay, so now we're talking narrow lots with the same separation.
Yeah.
So now we're either going up or we're going deep. And we still have the same look. I don't know if that's the look people in Corcoran really want, to be honest with you.
Well, there's a lot of them that have bought it.
There is a lot that have bought it.
I think I've told y'all, I'd rather have bigger yards and not have the responsibility fall on the city or anybody else in the open space. They own their own open space in their own yard, and that's the way it goes. I don't,
Well, most of the open space won't fall to the city. It'll be under the control of an HOA,
we hope.
which pulls it off the tax rolls.
Yep.
So you still have the same opportunity for homes. So the taxes aren't on the land, the taxes are on the value of the property.
The property
So
that the
through-
home sits on.
Right. And the home itself.
Right, but it's not, the outlot is not taxed in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So even amenity centers aren't taxed, so you can build a Taj Mahal of an amenity center, and we're not gonna get any money out of it to benefit the greater.
Unless it increases the value of the homes in the neighborhood to have it. In
That's,
which
I
case-
mean, that's debatable. I mean,
That's-
valuations, I mean, everyone that comes in the door talks about valuations, how they either positively affect them or negatively affect them, right? And to sit up here and to say you can make an assessment on that, we're just guessing at the air. But, I mean, if you're gonna go down this path, I'd recommend you do some type of chart with a sliding scale type deal. So lot size can vary if open space gets X, as your lot size comes down, open space goes up. that way if there's not room to have this open space, at least we know what the floor is for the size of the lot.
It's a good idea.
I'd be open to that.
Has anybody seen anything like that before? Throwing all over that?
I feel like Dayton has something similar where, not necessarily with open space, but they have a chart where if you do this, we will consider these lot sizes, so I could take a closer look at that.
We reviewed that as part of the urban conservation district. So it's a little bit different, but I think it's a tool we could use. If any of you remember that, I shared that with you with that.
I'd be interested to see that scale, and maybe this is something we also bring up at the joint work session, assuming we call that tonight.
The other challenge with that,
It kind of applies to both commissions.
as I think about it, it'll vary depending on the zoning that we're applying. So you'd need several charts, right, for low-density residential, medium, and high.
Just look at this real quick.
Does this, I mean, we talked about it somewhat in the other plan that we didn't move forward with, but does this talk about where the 15% is gonna be? I mean, if you look at a layout of the land, you could have 15% in an area that's upland, but yet unusable or accessible, right, depending on the topography of the land that we're talking about. You look at like Ravinia itself, you're gonna have an open space park, there's upland in there, but they can't build in that anyway.
So the draft does say that it needs to be accessible by residents and occupants. So if it was something that truly wasn't accessible, then it wouldn't qualify for that standard.
So a big island in the middle of a pond wouldn't count?
Correct, yeah.
Unless they have
Unless they
bridge.
provide kayaks or something. there.
Paddleboard.
I like the creativity there.
Different recreational amenity.
Can I ask a question of the council?
Sure.
So, it's just like as we get in the weeds here, we're gonna come across things that we're gonna wanna think about. Like, for example, number 9 has 50 points max, exceptional landscaping to buffer homes from major roads. So suppose someone comes in with a development that actually isn't near a major road. So, and then somebody else comes in with excellent buffering, and it happens to be next to a major road, so they get 50 points. And then somewhere along the lines, like that 50 points make a big difference in these two potential developments.
Yeah, I noticed
we-
that one too. I was gonna suggest that we maybe cut that one from 50, so some smaller values so it's less dominant.
Yeah.
It is a lot of points.
Yeah, and then also, in our first run through, I don't think we paid as close attention to the things that, I think we all kind of like the point system to a certain degree, but we should focus on actually
The
what
details.
are the things with 50 points the most important things? Are the things with 10 points the most important things? As we hone in on this, and then I worry about this point system, and just thinking about it from a builder's perspective. If they come in and they maybe they game it, maybe they don't, but they have a project that wins like 200 points, and then there's a project that comes in a week later with like 100 points. But we actually, if you pulled all 5 of us or the 5 new city council people in 15 years or whatever, if we have this point system and one gets 200 and one gets 100 points, and the one with 100 points is liked more than the other one from the city council's perspective? Like, if you pulled them, which one do you like better? I like the 100 one. Like, we painted into some box that the people who had a 200-point PUD put all this time and effort into meeting all these points that they were looking to get, and are we painted into a box where they said, we got twice as many points as the last one? Why aren't we able to do this when the last one got 100 points? I know we're saying that it doesn't mean anything. This point systems for, like, I like data, so like, it's awesome to have data. It gets a little bit fuzzy sometimes when you want to have data, but it's subjective rather than objective. I don't know how you make this stuff objective, but it gets to be challenging. But, so that's the thing I think, like, if we all like this set of criteria, how do you have it be such that you don't paint yourself in a corner? And then how do you have it be objective rather than subjective? And is there a different way to do it where we say, this is what we're looking for, and the council can make up their own mind how much weight they want to put at all this stuff, just to not have to force, someday there'll be something that comes in that everyone thinks is a dumb idea, but it gets so many points on the PUD scale that I know if I was a builder, if I wanted to just do something, I would totally game the point system. Not because I'm a bad guy, but they're in business to get houses built.
Do you think we're not being gamed now? I don't.
Well, to a certain degree, to a certain degree, builders think their ideas are good ideas, and they want to convince every council that they go before that this is a really good idea, and you should give me a PUD because I'm going to do all these amazing things. Like, they all can do that. I'm saying, it's hard to get out of a situation where we have these sets of rules. If they can really game and really put a council in a bad spot, where right now, if we have a PUD come before us and we say it's a bad idea, we can just say, no, it's a bad idea. We don't actually have.
Measurable, and we got content that we can't say no to.
That's not
No,
true. That's completely not true. And it bothers me that you guys keep saying things like that, because we're retaining discretion.
No,
We're intentionally retaining discretion regardless of what the points are.
I totally get that. You're saying we'll have points, but we'll also have discretion.
Correct.
And we have discretion now without points. So I'm just thinking aloud, don't feel picked on, because I want to.
Mr. Mayor, City Council, so, I mean, to address John's comments, first thing regarding the exceptional landscaping to buffer homes against major roads. If a parcel came in that they want to do a PUD and they don't abut a major roadway, then that point category would simply be taken out of the calculation. So they're not going to just lose a chance to get 50 points, it's just going to be taken out of that.
I get that. I get it, but
But
They
I
will have-
absolutely agree if we keep the point system.
opportunities
then-
for more points.
Yeah, well, yeah, if they're on a major roadway, but it's probably gonna be a much larger project too. But at the same time, I think that if you look at the point system and you agree, if you believe that this is not as important as something else I'd like to see, then yes, we should adjust the points accordingly. I'll just need direction to make the changes. I keep hearing that we want landscaping, that we want buffers, that we want open space, and so that's how I've drafted the points originally. But we can definitely make adjustments so that it properly reflects your priorities. The other option that was kind of alluded to is we can go away with the point system and simply put in the ordinance, these are the things that we're looking for. That is a perfectly fine approach as well. It's just, when we're talking about subjectivity versus objectivity, I would say the point system provides some more objectivity, because there are categories where it's a formula, 1,000 feet within a park.
Yeah, yeah.
There are formulas. The subjective scale is gonna be not true, somewhat true, mostly true, and that's probably where our discussions will take hold. But you're not going to be able to move away from subjectivity with development, because
Yeah.
sometimes it is within the eye of the beholder. But trying to get a slightly more standardized approach, that would be an option with the point system, or we could
Yeah.
go something more flexible. Either way is good to go.
Because I'm an analyst, it's almost impossible to create objective measures of subjective things. So, like, all these concepts resonate with me. And we are gonna get together with planning, I think, to further hone this. I'm just saying, when we do, we have to think about paint, and whether we paint ourselves in a box, like, we don't want to have council or planning just take their brains and put them on a platter and let these numbers decide the stuff. And then I also think we need to look at the weights of these things and see if it's what we want. So I think you and I have talked, so I'm gonna just address your concern. We both want the town to look more like the stuff you've assigned points to. I just want to make sure that if we have this system, it doesn't take away from what we're trying to do, but it actually makes the things that people have, the whole concept of we don't want to look like Maple Grove. We want to add things that we require out of builders to not make us basically look like Maple Grove. And I think you've done a really good job of it. I'm just kind of highlighting some things that we don't want to fall into the trap of.
Yeah.
That's all.
I would totally agree. It makes sense to me to confirm that the points are properly allocated. That's very reasonable, I think. In terms of the concern around painting ourselves into a corner, I think it's no more of a corner than we're in now, because we get people regularly coming up and reminding us of our vision and reminding us of
Yeah.
the values and the motto of the city. That's the kind of finger wagging that we deserve. And when we hear it often enough, it should prompt us to change the system. And that's really what this is intended to do. So we might get fingers wagged at us that a developer says, well, you let somebody buy with 76 points, 76%, and
Yeah.
I'm at 78%, why are you giving me a hard time? It's better to be in that position than the one that we're in today.
So maybe we're running low on time here. Next steps are for us all to take a look and see if we have any specific thoughts on tweaking certain scales or values that we put on some of the categories. Have staff look at
Yeah. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to change
No,
that, no.
I was like,
Yes,
uh-oh.
Definitely let me know your thoughts on where we might be not giving enough points, where we might be having too much points. Also, if there's any other categories that,
Yep.
come to you, we can always add that, or so.
So I would say we look at that, reach out to Natalie if we have any thoughts between now and then maybe we make this one of the discussion topics at the joint work session.
Okay, so, keeping that in mind, so basically between now and next Wednesday, so that I can get that packet for the 9th.
Yeah, and even if, I'd rather get this right than have a strict deadline as to when we get this done, so.
Okay, so just something
if-
that we could bring
that'd
as
be
with
great
the
if-
staff presentation?
Yeah,
on the 9th?
yep.
Okay.
And then if there's other stuff that comes up that's a good idea from there, then we'll just continue it on and keep refining until we get to a place we're comfortable with.
Good deal.
Regarding the other item with it, the 4/5, is everyone comfortable with that language? I think it seems to, after we spoke to the city attorney on some of the revised language and how that would work, I think that I'm comfortable with it.
4/5 seated,
Yep.
okay. And I think the only other thing was the neighborhood meeting, if we had thoughts on when
Yes.
that should occur.
Let's talk about it later.
That, let's have that, for the, I know at least one or two commissioners has some thoughts on that, so let's make sure we cover that at the
2/9,
meeting.
okay.
Perfect. Hey, anything else?
The 4/5, we should probably talk at that meeting too.
Okay.
I don't know
You
if
can
I'm
look at-
ready to commit to that.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, if there's nothing else, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That night we decided on